we're going to go ahead and get started with our first discussion this morning, and that will be housing solutions for people with disabilities. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our moderator, James May, Officer of Housing and Community Development for the City of Austin with the Housing Department. James, I will now ask for you to take on over and introduce everyone on the panel. We do have a timekeeper right in front of you. He will give you a 5-minute warning, which then will open up after that the 10-minute discussions question at the end. Folks in the audience, should you have any questions, there are 2 mics. When we open into discussion, you're more than welcome to form a line, or if there aren't any, you can continue having that last 10 minutes for the discussion, okay? Thank you.
Good morning. Hi, I'm Jamie May. I'm the Housing and Community Development Officer with the City of Austin. I am honored to be here moderating a panel concerning disability rights and ADA compliance in fair housing. We have an esteemed panel before us today, and I do hope that we can have a strong conversation, and I look forward to questions from the audience as well. First, all the way at the end, we have Nathan Darris. He is the Fair Housing Coordinator from the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs. Next in, we have Mr. Ron Lucy, Executive Director of the Fair Housing Council of South Texas. And
no, that's not true.
That is true?
That is not true.
That is not true. Then where am I? Oh, I'm sorry. Texas Governor's Committee with People with Disabilities. My apologies.
Thought I'd been fired.
I was moving too far down the list. And I do understand that the mayor said that any hard questions should go to you. So.
Okay. I appreciate that.
Next to me, we have Ms. Kaya DeBolt, attorney with the Disability Rights of Texas. And on the end, we have the Executive Director, Sandra Tamez, with Fair Housing Council of South Texas. All right. Thank you all for joining us today. And I'd like to give each of you an opportunity to just talk through your position and why you're on this panel. If you have a few moments, just a few quick seconds, please. Sandra, go ahead first.
Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Hi, my name is Sandra Tamez. I'm the Executive Director of the Fair Housing Council of South Texas. We receive funding by HUD specifically to do private enforcement initiative activities. We're a nonprofit. Our office is in San Antonio. So I did get up a little early this morning. It took me 2 hours. What is up with Austin traffic to make it here? I forgot how long. I used to live in Austin back in the day. I went to UT, go Horns. But in terms of my background, I've been doing this for a long time. I started in 1998 when it was just serving San Antonio. And now I've expanded the area to cover 37 counties in South Texas. We go all the way to Valverde County in Del Rio, down the border to Cameron County where Brownsville is, up the Gulf Coast to Corpus and Nueces, back up towards San Antonio, the surrounding areas. But the bulk of our work really is out of Bexar County. It's the majority of our complaints. The majority of our complaints deal with disability discrimination. We average about a little over 500 complaints from consumers a year. Probably close to 90% of those cases involve disability discrimination, the bulk of which deal with reasonable accommodations and reasonable modifications for renters. So thank you for inviting me here. I'm really excited to join and be able to discuss my own personal views on these topics.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kaya DeBolt, and I'm an attorney at Disability Rights Texas. For those of you not familiar with Disability Rights, we are Texas's protection and advocacy organization. Every state has one under federal law, and that means that we're the entity federally designated to advocate on behalf of individuals with disabilities. I work in our housing group. I've been there for about 2 years now, and we represent or advocate on behalf of individuals across the state who have housing disputes. So even though I'm local to Austin, my clients could be anywhere across the state. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Good morning. I'm Ron Lucy. I'm the Executive Director of the Texas Governor's Committee on People with Disabilities. We're a state agency and a trustee division within the Office of the Governor. We're an advisory committee to the Texas Legislature, to the Governor and the executive branch of government. We have 10 policy issue areas, and housing is certainly foremost among them today. My origin story with Texans with Disabilities goes back to here in Austin. I served as a city commissioner from 1994 to 2014 and chair of the Austin Mayor's Committee for People with Disabilities for 5 mayors, from Mayor Bruce Todd to Mayor Lee Leffingwell. And we made a lot of tremendous progress on accessible, inclusive housing for people with disabilities at that time. We take the lessons we learned here in Austin and we work with a network of local committees throughout the state, 20 different mayors' committees around the state of Texas. And we're also the voice of Texans with disabilities at the legislature.
Hi, I'm Nathan Darris. I'm with the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs. I'm the Fair Housing Coordinator there. And what exactly that means in any given day is different. Sometimes it means speaking with folks like Ron or Sandra. You all had several complaints, or not complaints, when you did testing that came through my department. So I handle complaints that handle fair housing issues. And I also help to guide the department policies on, usually on accessibility, accessible design, and to make sure that our policies are compliant with fair housing laws. I'm also fairly new to this. I've only been doing this for about 7 years now, I think is the time. So compared to everybody else here, I'm a little bit of a newbie.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here today. And we've got a list of a few questions, and I'm going to go a little bit out of order, just to keep it lively. First question I'd like to really talk about is just setting the playing field. What are some of the most significant barriers people with disabilities face in accessing fair and suitable housing? And what steps can policymakers take to address these challenges effectively? So let's start with, what are some significant barriers? If Sandra, if you'd like to start.
Turn my mic back on. Well, finding not only accessible housing, but affordable housing, right? So I think that, we're in 2024 and we're still dealing with enforcement of the Fair Housing Act when it applies to multifamily, new construction multifamily housing, when we're dealing with developers and builders and architects of new construction multifamily housing, and this has been on the books for so long. I think it's a shame after so much training, after so much enforcement, that we're still seeing these issues over and over again. One of the things that our office is also saying is when it comes to, because we're used to builders being or when dealing with compliance issues in multifamily housing, we weren't really aware of non-compliance when we're dealing with single-family homes. And so we knew, in terms of making sure that there's accessible housing stock in rental housing, there is a resource with the Fair Housing Act to make sure that there are housing options for people with disabilities, because we all know it's one step, a high threshold, a narrow door. These are all things that are obstacles for someone that's looking for, so someone that has mobility impairments. That is something that eliminates something off their list. So sometimes, especially people with mobility impairments, they've got to find something on the first floor, something in their price range. It's got to be not only on the first floor, it's accessible. So for an able-bodied person, it's so much easier. You don't have to restrict yourself to certain floors. And so the amount of accessible housing just shrinks, or that works for them, shrinks and shrinks and shrinks. And then also, if you add affordability, which we all kind of battle with, that's an issue. But also we see where these major builders, and we have lawsuits involving some major builders right now, of single-family homes not willing to comply with their requirements to allow home buyers that want to incorporate accessibility features into the plans for a single-family home, whether it be a roll-in shower or a ramp in a garage or accessible path into the home or wide enough doors. We're finding that builders are disregarding their responsibilities to make sure that home buyers can incorporate that, and not just in custom builders, but in when we're dealing with just building homes. So it's really important, I think, that when we're dealing with these obstacles that people are facing, whether they have a physical disability or mental disability, it's that the industry is still disregarding their responsibilities, right? So in order to create more inclusive communities, we have to think also in terms of not just race, but people with disabilities. You have to think, you It doesn't stop with people of color. It has to include inclusivity for people with disabilities too, because everyone deserves a high quality, a nice quality of life. And so much a part of that is whether or not your home is usable for you, right? If you have barriers every day in your home, can you imagine the quality of life that you would have if you had barriers day in and day out? And so it's really important that, tying into that there's proper enforcement of these laws too, that our government enforcement agencies take the appropriate steps to make sure that when housing providers or builders, et cetera, developers and architects disregard or forget about these laws, that there are consequences, because otherwise there's no deterrent for there ever to be change unless there's proper enforcement.
Thank you. Ron, would you like to pick up on some of that?
Yeah, there are challenges of affordability and challenges of accessibility. And I say we live and die by two codes, the building codes and the tax codes. And on the affordability side for single family housing, we were reminded yesterday that the median price of a home in Austin is $500,000. For Texans with disabilities that are going to try to aspire to a single family home, the best way to do that is to lift them out of poverty through programs like vocational rehabilitation, help them get a good education, help them get a good competitive integrated employment job and be part of the workforce. For individuals where that's not possible, people that are wanting to age in place, making sure that our tax code helps them be able to keep the home that they've lived in most of their life and age in place with dignity. Unfortunately, our single family housing stock, we're a victim of the design decisions that were made years ago. I live in a house built in 1962, about a mile from this conference center. And Austin has done some things that are really right. We passed a visitability ordinance here in this city that's the envy of other cities. And it didn't make our housing stock fully accessible, but it added 5 design tenets to make that house more adaptable for people with disabilities that want to take it further and make it more accessible. When it comes to multifamily housing, we also have our smart housing program, which goes a long way towards helping people with disabilities access affordable housing. We also have the architectural barrier removal program. If you think about it, when you move into an apartment, you're thinking about what pillows am I going to get for my couch? You're not thinking, do I need to replace that pedestal, that commode? Do I need to spend out of my own pocket for grab bars? Things that you and I would never think of doing when we move into an apartment. And fortunately, there are programs like ABR with the city of Austin that can help with that, but that program's funding has kind of dwindled over time.
Thank you. And yeah, we are very proud of those programs. We need to get the word out. So if everybody, tell your friends.
More later.
Yes. And what I'd like to go to is Nathan. Can you talk a little bit about sorts of partnerships between disability rights organizations, housing agencies, and private sector stakeholders? How we can leverage those partnerships better to address some of the things that Ron and Sandra mentioned?
Yeah.
Yeah, there we go. So I think I have to take a quick step back and point out that one of the barriers that we have identified, another step back, TDHCA just recently wrote the draft of the State of Texas Analysis of Impediments to Fair Housing Choice. It's out for comment right now. And last night we had our first in-person public comment session at Carver Library. And I bet you cannot guess how many people showed up to give public comment. And that answer was 0. And that is despite TDHCA leveraging the resources that we have. And so I think one of the barriers that we run into is that we may not be leveraging our partnerships well enough, because I can kind of name in the 4 public comment sessions we're going to have over the next month, I can probably name exactly who will be there. And I think y'all probably know the name of those groups too. And that's not enough, because while, yes, we do represent folks with disabilities, we are also maybe doing a disservice by not bringing more people with disabilities, not people in groups representing people with disabilities, right? The people themselves also need to be able to let us know, because at TDHCA, if we don't know what someone needs as a large state agency overseeing 3,000 multifamily properties, we're not quick enough. We're simply not quick enough to be able to make those kinds of moves in any kind of speedy fashion without that kind of regular input. And I don't even mean just every 5 years when we write the analysis of impediments. I mean when every year when we write our qualified allocation plan. Those are the rules that determine how we distribute our low-income housing tax credits across the state. That's several dozen multifamily properties around the state every year that have to abide by these rules for 20, 30, 40, even 50 years sometimes. So I think one of the things that I would like to see is leveraging our relationships more, asking more of each other, not just paying lip service to every once in a while we'll ask each other a question, every once in a while we show up to public comment sessions, but regularly being in contact with each other when something pops up. And I think that's would be a big help.
Thank you. Yeah, communication is huge, and it's definitely something we're all struggling with, how to communicate in this new environment, how to get the word out, and really promote the activities that we have that are serving the population.
Yeah, if I could add.
Yes, please.
One of the ways that TDHCA could help in its part is, for the longest time, I didn't know that the land use restrictive agreements called for properties that were awarded after 2001 for the owners to pay for modifications for people with disabilities. It was kind of like a well-kept secret that I then went and publicized, and I kind of brought cases on it. Our organization brought cases on it, and I just happened to read a LURA one day. I was bored, and if y'all are familiar with the LURA, it's a land use restrictive agreement that when properties are awarded tax credits, low-income housing tax credits, they have responsibilities, and part of those responsibilities for properties that were awarded after 2001, some properties pre-2001, I found it in like a 1999 agreement or something, they have to pay for structural modifications unless it's an undue financial burden. So for people with disabilities that live at their properties that need grab bars or other modifications to make it more usable for them and suitable for them due to their disabilities, the owner has to pay unless they can prove an undue financial burden. And this is a secret. It's something that's not publicized. It's something that the owners of the properties and management doesn't publicize. It's something that even their own employees aren't always aware of. We had to basically litigate it to kind of bring some awareness to it. That's one of the big ways that TDHCA could make affirmatively for furthering fair housing by partnering and educating disability rights groups, groups that specifically serve people with disabilities, so that their clients that they serve are aware of, hey, if you're looking for accessible housing, you also know that TDHCA, is really good. I say you're really good about making sure that now you're, reviewing properties for compliance with design construction requirements. But I think that that's something that should be publicized by TDHCA. It shouldn't be a secret. It's an obligation on their part, right? So, and in turn for these great tax breaks, they need to uphold their responsibilities under that LURA. And I think that's a wonderful way that we can kind of educate the public and especially disability rights groups, so that they in turn can educate their own clients, so that this was something that would really benefit them and would not go kind of just disregarded and ignored.
Absolutely. And Kaya, could you kind of build off of that and maybe speak to how fair housing laws can be effectively enforced to prevent discrimination against people with disabilities in the housing market, particularly in terms of reasonable accommodations and modifications?
Yeah, so that's mostly what I do, reasonable accommodations and reasonable modifications on behalf of typically renters in the state. Our process at Disability Rights Texas is to first come in and try to amicably resolve the issue. So that's working in the interactive process with landlords, sometimes with developers, to get our clients what they need. But if that doesn't work, there are a few options available to tenants. Things like filing a HUD complaint, filing a lawsuit, or going to the media. Those are all things that we.
That works. Sometimes it does.
Those are all things that we recommend to our clients if they're running into those kinds of issues.
Excellent. And when we're talking about those type of issues, like reasonable accommodations, Ron, can you pick up on what some specific design features or modifications that people with disabilities might face?
Yeah, we were talking about building codes yesterday when you had the gentleman from the ABA. The basic design codes under the Fair Housing Act are very similar to what we have under visitability. A no step or low step entrance with a 1/2 inch, and levers instead of knobs for doorways, a 32-inch doorway, and those are all very minimal standards. Here it is, the 21st century, and we're still leaning on standards from the 1980s. We can go beyond that when it comes to making sure that multifamily housing is accessible. You got to look not just at the unit, but the property. Gated or secure apartment complexes have keypads, and people who are deaf or hard of hearing may not be able to ring up the person that they're visiting. So we need to make sure that that technology is accessible for people with sensory disabilities. People with low vision, people who have blindness need to be able to have a tactily discernible keypad to be able to access that same feature. People, little people of small stature may need peepholes that are at different heights. And so looking at kind of a functional approach to housing from the moment you get on the property to the moment you step into the unit. And a lot of the features that we talk about don't necessarily cost any more. The price difference between a lever and a doorknob is minimal. When advocates were going to the city council to advocate for the visitability ordinance, which applies to single family housing, I quickly grabbed a medium-sized coffee from Austin Java Company, which is the cafe where City Hall is, and I wrote the price on the cup. And when we were trying to tell how much this would cost the average homeowner to implement visitability standards, averaged out over a 30-year fixed rate mortgage at the interest rate at the time, it was the equivalent of a medium-sized coffee from Austin Java Company. So the home builders were saying we can't afford to do this, and I was saying it's $3.69. Is there anybody that says they can't afford to age in place in their home and have a more accessible home for $3.69 per month? I don't think we can really say that cost is a barrier to doing a lot of these things. The 15-inch height for an electrical outlet so that a person in a wheelchair doesn't fall out of their chair plugging their iPhone into the wall. 15 inches is a little bit higher than 12 inches, but does anybody know why it's 12 inches, the standard? It's the height of a carpenter's hammer. We have our design standard to convenience the carpenter, not the person with a disability. And that extra few inches makes the difference between somebody in a wheelchair being able to plug in their phone or not be able to plug in their phone. So we need to design for human beings and not for carpenter's hammers.
And if I could jump in also, sometimes it's a matter of enforcing the requirements that are already there. So I have a current client whose complex doesn't have an accessible route throughout the entire complex. There's, sidewalks that lead straight into staircases. Their accessible parking spaces don't have accessible access. So, those striped lines that you see next to accessible parking spaces, nowhere to be found here, which obviously is a huge problem if you're talking about cars and things like this, cars being parked there. Disability Rights Texas, we usually deal with, our clients are renters, and a lot of the time, their complexes have some sort of federal funding. So while it's not perfect, a lot of the times these kinds of issues aren't a problem because they're, federally mandated to do that. But in this particular complex, it was a privately owned and operated complex. And so there's obviously things that just kind of slip through the cracks.
There's the number one issue we get calls for at the governor's office related to fair housing is not what y'all would think. It's not an architectural barrier. And when I say this, y'all are going to say, that's right. The number one call we get is related to emotional support animals and service animals and discrimination or allegations of discrimination against people that want to have an ESA or a service animal. And there is quite a bit of fraud out there, both on the side of people selling fake documents on the internet and people that want to avoid a pet deposit by declaring their pet an ESA or a service animal. But the law is clear on what property managers can ask and what can be expected. And so that we spend more time on that issue. And we have resources on our website that can help y'all understand the law and what it is. We also have a state law related to assistance animals, and we're trying to clean up that law to make it less confusing for property managers and places of public accommodation. The Texas legislature used the unhelpful term assistance animal rather than emotional support animal under the Fair Housing Act or service animal under the ADA. And so we're trying to make it more clear what people can ask and what the law is.
So Ron, that brings up a really good question because when I started writing the training that I give on assistance animals, that's the term that I used. And that was the term that the HUD guidance suggested using as opposed to differentiating between an emotional support animal and a service animal, because in terms of housing, the difference is minimal, right? It's just in what questions you can ask. So would it be more helpful to stop using the more nebulous assistance animal?
What we're talking about is context here. And with respect to my friend from Disability Rights Texas, you know that there's a saying, if you ask 3 attorneys a question, you're going to get 4 different answers. And we put that to the test. We locked 3 attorneys in a conference room for 2 hours to take Chapter 121 of the Human Resources Code, which governs assistance animals, and ask them to develop a consensus on rewriting that for the 89th Texas legislature. And Jeff Miller from your agency was one of those attorneys. And we think we came up with a statute that's going to make more sense. Obviously, an ESA, an emotional support animal, is covered under the Fair Housing Act, but can't travel to a place of public accommodation like a grocery store or on a Capital Metro bus. But a service animal can. Both of them are covered under the Fair Housing Act. A service animal is a trained animal, and you can ask questions about what tasks it's trained to perform. An ESA doesn't have to be trained, and it doesn't even have to be a canine. So we fortunately have a resource guide on our website that makes this less opaque. And Rebecca, hold up your hand. Rebecca's our research specialist. She's produced that document, and we have copies of it available, and it's also on our website. But I think unfortunately, the law is not always written in a way that makes it abundantly clear for everybody.
Yeah, I agree. Shameless plug here. On the 29th of April, TDHCA, me, you'll get to hear a lot more of me if you do this. We're hosting it's an hour-and-a-half training on assistance animals, and there's only 45 minutes of material, but I guarantee you we'll go the full 90 minutes just with questions alone. If you have questions about that topic, please join us. The number of people who should know the answers to these questions, folks who work on in multifamily properties who ask some of the silliest questions that I just talked about 15 minutes prior is a little bit weird, I'll admit, but it does happen. So come, show up. It's a very useful training.
So better communication, better explanation of responsibilities. That's one thing. Sandra, can you talk about how we can better incentivize developers and better require these implementations that we talked about?
Yeah, and actually I wanted to just, before I touch on that, and I will, I wanted to just, when we're talking about modifications, one of the things that we always all forget too is we focus a lot on renters, because there are a lot of renters. The bulk of our clients are renters. But there's also the rights of homeowners that have someone in the household that has a disability, that has the ability to be able to make modifications and just get permission from the HOA. We get quite a few requests from homeowners Even one as recently that involved a condo at the island wanting to install a ramp that would provide access to the beach. So there are, situations where you have to then get permission from an HOA. I just did a training for a homeowners association last week where someone wanted to install a lift at a condo. And so there's also owners that have a household member that has a disability where they're trying to make their home more accessible and wanting to seek permission. And we just need to make sure that also HOAs are following fair housing laws too. But to transition, the incentives, there's incentives already, with tax credit programs and things like that. And there's things that, like, for example, different cities do that incentivize affordable housing. But and my background is in enforcement, and I'm an attorney too. And so my vote is for the assistance animal only because so many people that work in rental housing and in management get caught up in ADA and think service, and there needs to be a different word. Because so many times they just think of ADA and service animal, and they forget about emotional support animals, and fair housing covers both. And I think the government was just trying to create an umbrella that covered both of them under one assistance. But I think there needs to be more enforcement. I think that without an actual legal deterrent, housing providers will continue to violate the law. If they know that they could be subject to an administrative complaint that goes to a local government or a state government, and there isn't strong enforcement there, and they know they can just bide their time and wait it out, and eventually it'll receive a no-cause determination. That is not a deterrent. That is, in my opinion, lack of enforcement that goes against responsibilities to have a substantially equivalent law and enforcement in that particular city or state. That's going to be a deterrent for housing providers to not violate the law. Because if a housing provider, and I'm sure, and many of us deal with some of the same attorneys for housing providers all the time, when they know the way the system works, and we know there's not effective enforcement, and we know they can just bide their time and it'll be administratively closed for one reason or another and not charged, there is no incentive there for housing providers to abide the law. And I'm not saying all the housing providers discriminate, but for the ones that do, they need to be at least think about, wait, what is the law, and am I going to get in trouble because of it? Because we had a complaint with, TWC, with our Civil Rights Division. That was no cause, which we're litigating now against a builder, and that the decision went against even HUD and Department of Justice guidance. That should not be happening in our state. Consumers are not getting the type of proper investigation that's happening, and I think that is one of the biggest obstacles to housing providers coming into compliance, is when there's not effective enforcement. That's my 2 cents as an advocate, so I'm sure that people in the field would disagree.
There are a couple of other enforcement tools that have not been mentioned at this conference even once. And yesterday when we were talking about the ADA standards, what we were really talking about here in Texas is the Texas Accessibility Standards, which are promulgated by the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation. They have an enforcement division, and for multifamily housing, the leasing office in the common areas, the mailboxes that may not be accessible in those areas are covered by the Texas Accessibility Standards, and their enforcement division is crisp. They are sharp. If you make a phone call, they will do a prompt investigation, and they can fine the individual for violating the Texas Accessibility Standards. And if Texas were its own country, we would be, I think it was said, the 11th largest economy in the world. But if you were to ask TDLR the number of architectural barrier investigations or complaints that they get, it is shockingly low. It is less than 800 per year. And so if you're thinking the parking for the leasing office is not accessible, or the path of travel for the mailboxes, or any of the common areas that are not covered by fair housing but are covered under the ADA are not accessible, there's a remedy for that. And then beyond that, we also have local code enforcement for some of the other things. And people they'll call civil rights, but sometimes it's a code enforcement issue for some of the other standards we're talking about.
Absolutely. Yes. We've got several properties where code enforcement is on speed dial. So yes, but the department enforcing ADA standards or enforcing the Texas accessibility standards, That's information that we should get out.
Yes.
We can publicize that phone number as far and wide. I don't want them to be bored.
No.
So, Kaya, could you pick up on some of those innovation suggestions and where we're headed?
Yeah, so obviously in Texas, you're not finding too many yet, but we look at actually North Carolina. They have a couple of innovative housing programs created as part of a 2012 Olmstead violation, which for those of you who aren't familiar with that, it is a case that deals with the intentional segregation of people with disabilities under the ADA. And basically, North Carolina got in trouble back in 2012 for putting too many people who are experiencing serious mental illness into adult care homes. So they implemented what they call a targeting program, which focuses on permanent supportive housing. So there's partnerships there between the health agency and the housing agency that ultimately results in a set aside of permanent supportive housing units in new LIHTC properties. So these properties prioritize people experiencing mental illness who would have otherwise had to enter an adult care home.
Great. Yeah. And you mentioned LIHTC, low-income housing tax credits. That's been mentioned twice, and I'm sure, Nathan, you've been expecting this to come to you. As TDHCA manages the LIHTC program for Texas, can you talk about, pick up on what Kai mentioned, maybe some more innovative ways that we can build in support services through tax credit properties?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to go ahead and consider myself, I'll be the QAP guy. I'm going to repeat that phrase a lot, qualified allocation plan. Some of the best innovations that we've had at TDHCA in this regard came out of suggestions at qualified allocation plan hearings. So, number one, mark them down on your calendar, go to these roundtables. It's almost entirely driven by developers, which is not ideal. I mean, we even know that, but it's hard to get people to come to these meetings. They're dry. You have to read a whole chunk of Texas administrative code. But we have had some successes. One, these aren't necessarily specific to the tax, well, one of them is. Some of these are specific to the tax credit program. One is the Project Access Program, which has allowed us to get vouchers to individuals who are leaving institutions. Those vouchers are good statewide, not just in the 34 counties that TDHCA does administer a Section 8 program in. So they are good statewide. The one that is specific to tax credit programs is Section 811, very similar to Project Access. It's really only in the major metropolitan areas. But we have also been able to leverage that program, which also, if anybody in here is from DFPS related to that, there are 3 populations that are eligible for this, and one of them we barely get anybody to refer clients from, and that is from youth exiting foster care. Please, if you know anybody who is at all related to that program, we would love to have more, more referrals from that area. One of the things that we've been able to do with Money Follows the Person funds is to fund in Section 811 units and tenants who have Section 811, who are Section 811 clients, is to incentivize landlords to take in somebody who would otherwise not have qualified, whether it be for poor rental history before, whether it be sometimes in the case of if there's a criminal background check and something related to a disability is keeping them from being able to be housed in that indirect way. These funds have been able to help incentivize that. And then the final one, and I'll just go ahead and plug this in here, is 24% of Texans over the age of 65 have a mobility disability. 7%, 8% have a vision disability or impairment of some sort, and 14% have some sort of auditory impairment. The minimum standards right now in LIHTC housing for what we call UFAS units, or Uniform Federal Accessibility Standards units that have features for individuals who have a mobility or auditory or visual impairment, is 5% and 2%. So 5% of our units have to be set aside for mobility features. 2% have to be set aside for auditory visual features. Those can't overlap, so it ends up being a total of 7%. So altogether, we're still not hitting the amount of Texans over 65. Those numbers are the same whether that's a family or unit or a family property or an elderly property. Why do those need to be coupled to something other than numbers, which we have that data for? So, I mean, there are, if you have innovations, if you have thoughts about changes, the QAP process is the place to get that information to us for the low-income housing tax credit properties. It is the only place, really, where we're going to be able to do anything about it. Because if it's not mentioned there, it's very, very hard to get it off the ground.
I want to echo what Nathan says. There's a saying in the disability community, nothing about us without us. And we have another saying up at the Capitol, if you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu. People with disabilities need to be at the table making policy. And we have several examples this morning of where that succeeded. The Smart Housing Program in Austin was a settlement agreement between the disability group ADAPT and the city of Austin in the 1990s. The visitability ordinance came about through a strong coalition of disability organizations in the 2000s to make sure, and it took 2 attempts for that to happen, but it succeeded. After Hurricane Harvey, we got the General Land Office to agree to make sure that when we were rebuilding homes that they would be built to an accessibility standard, even single family homes. After Winter Storm Uri, through advocacy from people with disabilities, FEMA changed its individual assistance policy to make sure that their assistance added additional funds to cover accessibility features of those houses that needed to be repaired or reconstructed. So policy does get better for people with disabilities when they're at the table and they're being a part of it.
I was going to jump back in. Earlier, we were talking about ways that we can incentivize adding accessible features to projects. And the QAP is one of the biggest ways that push can happen. QAP often results in tiebreakers for the LIHTC program. And so if there were even small things that were added as a tiebreaker, that would be a huge help in terms of incentivizing those accessible accommodations. Yeah.
And so, again, we're talking about communication, improvements in communication, coming to the table, being present, having tools that can actually serve the population, serve the needs. Let's talk a little bit more about community-based support services. When we're talking about developments for individuals who need those ongoing support, how can we get the community involved? Sandra, do you have any insight on that?
Well, the community as a whole involved?
Well, community as a whole and the support services, specifically speaking to people with disabilities to promote independent living.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that, I can speak to San Antonio. I don't know much for Austin, sorry. But for San Antonio, a lot of things like our Center for Healthcare Services partners with like our local housing authorities to see how to create supportive housing programs on site at rental housing sites so that people don't have to go elsewhere, not only for counseling, for case management, for skills training, but for healthcare too. And so it's a kind of like a one-stop shop to help people with disabilities be able to not be displaced, to address the issues that come up. And so it's something that we're kind of looking at to see how successful. I think anything where you don't have to leave your own home to try to get assistance, and you go down to a site on site where you can get training and counseling, medical services, case management, and assistance with whatever it is that you're dealing with that day, whether it be transportation, benefits, or what have you, helps to keep people living independently, increases their quality of life when we don't have to like search for those services, but they're on hand. So I think ways that groups that provide services with disabilities can partner with housing providers to see how these housing services programs, supportive housing programs can be incorporated in these housing situations on site can be beneficial.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that can happen when you're talking about housing for individuals with disabilities is you can get pigeonholed into just looking at houses, just looking at rental units, things like that. But really, there's so much more that goes into having stable housing, including things like food security, employment, transportation. And so I think looking at and providing a space in the community where individuals can access those different things and have support for those different things is ultimately going to be supportive of their housing choice. So their ability to stay in the housing of their choice rather than being institutionalized.
I think that some of the models of intentional communities like Community First Village from Mobile Loaves and Fishes is an option. It's not the option. It's not integrated housing, but it's a model that works. We're looking at other states like the state of Utah that focuses on a housing first option. And it's a very conservative state, and they've realized that by going with housing first, that and then wrapping services and employment supports around those individuals, they're getting less recidivism of homelessness and they're seeing more success. And it's certainly a model that Texas needs to look at. Integrated housing should always be the goal, but as we build communities like Mueller and the community where the bus tour happened, making sure that workforce centers are present, even smaller satellite offices, so that people can access services where they live and don't have to live where services are.
Do you want to add, Nathan? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and repeat myself, QAP. There are low-income housing tax credit awards for transitional and supportive housing and integrated housing. Part of the scoring often relates to things that everybody's mentioned here, like proximity to food, proximity to services, proximity to transit. Those are things that can make a huge difference, even in a small change can make a huge difference in making a LIHTC property that maybe doesn't have supportive services on property still be a good place for someone who needs supportive services to live if it's located close enough to either the services themselves or the ability to get there, right? So those are things that can be tweaked, they can be changed in the QAP, they can be scored, they can be tiebreakers. These are things that we could make a fix on for, at least for LIHTC properties, fairly easily.
It seems like we're talking about analog solutions, which is great because it's communication based. It's talking to your neighbor, making sure that people understand the issues and the potential solutions. What role does technology play into this? John, can you pick that up, or Ron, can you pick that up? What role does technology play in
Sure.
helping people live independently?
Last week, the U.S. Justice Department issued final rulemaking for Title II of the ADA as it applies to state and local government. And this covers everybody in this room. It cited a standard Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG 2.1. And it doesn't just apply to government, it applies to your contractors, your service providers. And one of the barriers that we hear about from people with disabilities in accessing housing programs is for individuals with sensory disabilities, they hit a brick wall when it comes to inaccessible business processes on websites and applications. If you are a person who's blind and you can't use your assistive technology to fill out that housing voucher application, you don't have a fair shot at housing. We need to make sure that our technology is accessible, and accessible web content happens by design, not by luck. If you have to ask somebody else, is this accessible? Chances are it probably isn't. So you need to make sure that your webmaster for your housing department or your civil rights department attends accessibility training. And we have some of the best web accessibility training in the nation right here in Austin. In May, there's a nonprofit organization called Nobility that puts on a web accessibility conference at St. Edward's University. If y'all have a web developer in your department, send them to that training. When it comes to leaning forward into the 21st century with technology, just 3 miles up the road from here is IBM. And IBM, before COVID, they had a smart housing lab, not smart housing like the program, but looking at how we can support people with disabilities in housing into the future using more technology, more artificial intelligence. And so they had baked Watson into a model apartment on the campus of IBM. I think people, it's hard for them to visualize what accessibility looks like. And so having model apartments that people they can see it, they can touch it, they can experience it. And it doesn't have to look clinical, it doesn't have to look institutional. It can be a beautiful home that works for everybody with universal design.
I think one of the things that we found with COVID was a lot of technological innovation that kind of came, even in terms of like having hearings over Zoom and things like that. One of the things that we do at Disability Rights, we get hundreds of requests for services. There are 4 attorneys on my team. And so we can't help everybody. But one of the, kind of technological things that we do is we have a generator online for a variety of our reasonable accommodations where individuals can go on our website, type in some of the specifics to their accommodation request, and print out a letter that they can take to their housing provider to request those accommodations. And so I think things like that and being adaptive in the same ways that we kind of had to learn to be adaptive through the COVID pandemic are helpful in this area too.
And I think we've got time for one more question, then we'll open it up to the crowd. And just to close it out, I wanted to talk about inclusive communities. We've talked about individualized or individual single-family detached units. We've also talked about fully accessible multifamily developments. We talk about inclusive communities. What strategies and initiatives have been most promising, have really shown to be successful in promoting the integration and promoting individual support? I'm going to start I'll start with Ron.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the best public policy is the public policy that's made in cooperation with people with disabilities, making sure that you have boards and commissions that include people with disabilities on those advisory boards and commissions. City council needs to hear from city departments, but those city departments need to hear from people with disabilities. Just to be inclusive, people with disabilities are not a monolithic group. It includes people of all age ranges, people of all races, people of all backgrounds. If you have a preconceived notion of what a person with a disability is, it's both right and wrong because it's a very diverse group. We need to make sure, for example, when we're talking about communication strategies and technology, that we're thinking about how people who are deaf or hard of hearing interact with information. Big walls of complex text and jargon doesn't always work for people who are deaf or hard of hearing, whose first language is American Sign Language, and they may read English at a 4th or 5th grade level. And so when we post information in other languages like Spanish, consider posting complex information in an American Sign Language video that's going to explain complex housing information to the deaf community. We have a big deaf community in Austin with the Texas School for the Deaf, and one of my personal success, my son's an Eagle Scout, and his Eagle project was providing accessible fire alarms for people who are deaf here in Austin through the Austin Fire Department, and then creating a video to make people aware of that that's posted through the City of Austin Public Information Office. So if you're thinking about people with disabilities, think expansively. It's a bigger group than you think.
Yeah, I was gonna what you said right at the beginning is exactly what I have as a talking point is listening to individuals with disabilities. I might be, somewhat of a subject matter expert in this area, but I don't know the lived experience of my clients, and ultimately they know what's best for them. So I would just say that listening to clients with disabilities, what they want and what they need is extremely important.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. One of the things that when I train on incoming staff, and I always tell them, don't assume anything, right? When you're speaking with someone, and even if you're familiar with that particular diagnosis or with that particular condition, you don't know their experience dealing with that particular, whether it's a mental health issue or physical limitation. And everyone is different. And, it's not just physical disabilities, but mental disabilities. And everyone is different. And so a lot of time what we do is collaboratively with the consumer brainstorm ideas that can help benefit them and their living situation, because everyone is different, but you have to hear from them, right? Because you always talk about you can't walk in someone else's shoes. It's exactly that. You have to get their perspective about how things impact them, because it impacts everyone differently.
I'm just going to echo what everybody else here said. I don't know that I have that much more to offer aside from, there are programs that maybe folks don't know about. And, we've talked about, bringing folks with disabilities into the process and then being part of that process. One of the things that I did not mention before, and because TDHCA focuses almost solely on rental properties in terms of what we can enforce. We have home buyer programs. But one of the things we also have is what's called the Amy Young Barrier Removal Program. And I just realized now it's probably also named after, similarly to the Architectural Barrier Removal Program. It is exactly the same idea, which is it provides grants to low-income households who own their own home to help make modifications to that home to make it accessible so they can age in place. So those 1962 built homes that are just not really built for with that in mind, there are funds available, not just in Austin, but statewide, that can help. And I think that has helped a lot, along with the programs I mentioned before, Project Access, Section 811, have helped to foster that inclusivity.
Absolutely. And leveraging the state programs against local programs to get a bigger benefit, bigger bang for the buck. That's exactly what we're trying to lead into. So thank you for that. If there are any questions from the audience, we'd love to take those now. See somebody walking up? Yes, ma'am. Is it on?
Green light. Can you hear me now? Okay. Good morning. Thank you for being here. My name is Andrea Freiberger. I'm Spring Architects. So my head is in the built environment very much. We try to be part of the solution. So the question today has to do with the visitability ordinance, which the city of Austin has adopted. And we feel like in multifamily residential, there are very clear-cut rules, and while the percentages of what's required might not be high enough to meet the actual population, in the single-family world, visitability is a very low threshold. And so I'm curious if anyone on the panel, and maybe Ron specifically, maybe James, just because of your connection with the city of Austin, if you have any recommendations for how we could go further, because visitability requires basically a path into and through the first floor of your dwelling unit, but it doesn't require that you have a bedroom on the first floor or even a fully functional bathroom on the first floor. And so it's nice, but for someone who really needs to live in that home and maybe they're using a wheelchair, it could still be a really, it's not even close to meeting all of their needs.
I'm going to pass that to Ron because that is one of those tough questions the mayor mentioned.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you. It's refreshing to hear from a developer who supports visitability and wants to see it go further, because there was tremendous opposition from the home building community back then. And one of the successes of being able to get it to pass was hearing the concerns of the home building community and honoring them. Like, we have to redo all of our architectural plans. Well, in that case, we won't implement this for 18 months or 2 years. Or, we need a variance process for houses that are built in the hill country. Guess what? West Austin is the hill country. And so having those variances allowed this to be a success. Taking it further, I do agree, is a good idea, but it's going to have to, it's a political question too. The economics of building a house in Austin is that most of the houses are now 2-story, smaller lots in 2-story. And if I'm a person with a mobility impairment, I'm not going to buy a 2-story house. And so a lot of what we're seeing with single-story, single-family homes is the older housing stock. I do like the idea of at least 1 bedroom on the ground floor. I think that is certainly one that I think could be negotiated. But as we work towards change or updates to visitability, it should be done in tandem with the home building community and not imposed upon them. And one of the reasons it did succeed is because we heard their concerns and we said, okay, you're right on these. You're not right on cost being a barrier, because once again, we're talking about the price of a medium cup of coffee for $3.69 a month. Now, interest rates are higher now, but they're not always going to be at that rate.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask a question specifically about public transit. So I know you mentioned Community First Village, and while it is a good model, I want you to recognize that the bus runs every 60 minutes. So the individuals who are in wheelchairs, if the bus gets canceled, they're waiting 2 hours. And so as it relates to low-income housing tax credit developments, I would like to know if the QA process is what would incentivize mixed-use development of some sort, even if it's a cafe. And lastly, would just let you know that for our low-income housing tax credits, it's actually 1 to 5 miles to the bus stop. And so I would just appreciate if ADAPT of Texas would actually take on this challenge, because it's in the December 15, 2020 Travis County backup materials. So if you have any insights, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, can I ask a quick question back
Sure.
to you? Is it okay if I ask which property, or when the property that you're referring to, the one that's 1 to 5 miles from transit, was built?
So this is in the December 15th, 2020 board packet, but it is consistent. So I can tell you that about 2 weeks ago, council and also Travis County actually approved some more developments off of Decker Lane, and that's where so it's recent, but you can actually see the chart from CDBG. The Community Development Block Grant is actually in the board packet, because I asked for the bus stop distance. It's just unfair to people who are low income, and the developers often say, we're not incentivized to put the cafes or anything like that because it's not in the 4% low-income housing tax credit development packet.
Yeah, so you hit on a really important difference, which is the difference between the 9%, what's called competitive housing tax credits, and 4%, which is called non-competitive housing. My attorneys will tell me to say, it's not always non-competitive. It's a difference, and it's a term of art, and has not had much meaning in difference. But yeah, you've hit on a difference there. Yes, the QAP process is still the best way as far as the tax credit program to do that. The second way to do that is TDHCA's board meetings, not necessarily a City of Austin, because you'll want to, TDHCA is the primary awarder of tax credits, whether that be 9 or 4%. So by the time the City of Austin knows it's coming, we've already known about it. We've known about it for months. Our pre-applications for 2025 will probably start coming in here pretty soon. I mean, the process is about 11 months long. So yes, that is something that can be contemplated in the QAP. Mixed use is one of those things where we have done some research on it. It is very, very difficult to get it to work cost-wise on a 4% tax credit property, because while it sounds like a small difference, the difference between 9% and 4%, I won't get into the technicalities of what that means. It's a lot of money over a 10-year period. So it does make that difference. It's very hard to incentivize mixed use in 4%. It does happen in 9%. Mueller is a very good example. Wildflower Terrace has like a yoga studio at the bottom of it, and I think there's other businesses there too. So it is possible. It just takes a lot more planning, and it takes a lot of community support. That's like a huge part of it. You want to make sure that you could build that community support around it, because community support is worth, like, man, in a competitive tax credit, it's like 30-something points, 36 points, and most awards only need about 100 to 120 points to win an award. So if you can get a lot of community support around it, you can build a lot better or stronger competitive mixed use application.
Very quickly regarding Capital Metro and transportation. I don't work for Capital Metro, I can't speak for them, but fixed route transit doesn't mean fixed schedule. And there is a process for getting schedules changed for transit stops. Capital Metro has all their board meetings are covered under the Open Meetings Act, and it's possible to give public comment at those board meetings, and they also have an access advisory committee that can give input. I know Martin Carethi is our accessibility coordinator, and he's very attuned to the needs of the disability community. So I would raise that directly with them and see if they can improve scheduling. There is mixed transit available for people with mobility impairments. They may be eligible for paratransit through Capital Metro's Metro Access program. So that is a potential solution.
And I won't dominate, but I will push back and just let you know that there are over 200 or 300 people at Community First Village, and they're putting, about 640 more in Burleson, where there's no Sunday service because that's a VA bus. And I'm that Title VI advocate that's been doing this work since 2016, and they're not listening to us. So I just want you to recognize that where there's essentially nobody getting on the bus on Convict Hill in the white neighborhoods, unfortunately I have to use that white-black comparison, that is where the transit is actually running. And so I just, we just need support for our individuals who can't walk the distance. And to your point about the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs, I would just ask you to look at your public input process, because it's pretty subjective and they don't always allow the public to make those comments. So thank you.
Hi, I'm probably in the wrong place at the wrong time. My name is Mitzi. I'm a St. Vincent de Paul Society volunteer. We work at the other end, at the person end of these dilemmas. And we work, I'm from St. Austin Catholic Parish, and our zip codes are in Central Austin. We work often at Blacklands, often at Travis Flats, often at Roosevelt Gardens. Here's the thing. Blacklands, what a great idea. Why can't people get repairs at Blacklands? Why can't people have heating and air conditioning? Why did a mother have to tell us, please walk in my footsteps because my son just went through the floor the other day? We've called, some managers have been very effective there about meeting these needs. Others simply don't respond. For people with intellectual differences, getting a fair accounting of what they owe at Travis Flats. They'll get bills for $1,200 when the month before they had zero. It's a process that doesn't put people first. And I don't know, so I got here because I attended a city council session where I was clearly out of my depth. But these are the issues that we need to know how to fix, because we have $350 per individual every 6 months, $200 to help with utility bills. What can we do to make a difference?
You need a fair housing advocate right here in your service area.
I was just about to say that sounds like a lot of the work that we do at Disability Rights Texas in terms of making that headway with landlords, developers, things like that. So I would highly encourage, and like I said, we just don't have the resources for every case, but we do try at least to give advice if we don't. And we do have those resources like the letter generators, things like that. I know it's difficult to work with landlords. Sorry if there's any landlords in here.
If there are, please listen.
I'll give you some tips right now. Okay, so this is what we do in San Antonio. So we work closely with our code compliance department to get them to go out and inspect. And granted, they're not perfect, right? In any city, they probably aren't perfect. But what we do is we utilize the Fair Housing Act as a way, as a way to get expedited repairs of health and safety issues that are impacting somebody with a physical or mental disability. For example, if their refrigerator isn't working and they're diabetic and their insulin needs to be, refrigerated, because it could impact their disability, we submit a reasonable accommodation request on their behalf, asking for it to be expedited and prioritized ahead of everyone else's so that their health and safety issue is addressed. If there's mold and they have a respiratory condition, we ask that theirs be prioritized. You need a fair housing advocate on your side to do this. You could do it yourself, but you're busy, right? So there used to be the Austin Tenants Council. It was a longstanding fair housing organization here in the city. Now they're kind of under the umbrella of legal aid. I would say legal aid is great. Reach out to them for assistance. I know they're building back up again.
Their lines are
I know.
so
I hate that they're now,
long.
I love legal aid, but they're now under the umbrella of legal aid. They're not independent anymore. But they've got funding now. So they're going to probably build their staff up again. I'm sorry that I don't serve this area. I want to come help you. But because that's what we do every summer. We get so many requests for for AC and things like that. And we work those because no one else is. And so it's a matter for us, for fair housing, is looking to see the person with disability. Heat affects everyone. Heat affects somebody that's schizophrenic. Heat affects somebody with diabetes. Heat affects across the board so many disabilities, whether it's mental or physical. And so we tie the need for expedited repairs, and there are cases on this, FYI investigators. There are cases, maybe not in Texas, but in California, that are settled on this matter, where fair housing, you can have accommodations regarding services. Repairs are a service associated with apartment rental, and you can ask for an exception. And so basically, you need an advocate on your side. I'm sorry, but if you can't reach out to disability rights or legal aid, we can give you templates on what to say and what to do. Unfortunately, you're not in my service area, but we do trainings. You can Zoom, and we'll help you, how to advocate. But that's what it takes. Unfortunately, we live in a state where the landlord doesn't have to do repairs, but the minute you withhold your rent because you don't think it's fair, they can stop doing repairs and they can evict you. It's not fair. It's very landlord leaning, the law is. And so many tenants wrongfully think they're not doing repairs, so I'm not going to do my part either, and I'm not going to pay my rent. And the minute they do that, they lost the right to repairs. And so they pay their rent religiously, and they live in the substandard housing or mold and lack of hot water and all these other things that are unsanitary. And so I feel your pain and your client's pain, and we need more advocates in Travis County to help address these issues.
Yeah, and I would love to talk with you more later about this, so please come find me.
Thank you. Our neighbors really need you to hear and speak for them because they really don't have voices that are heard.
Quick 5 seconds. If it's a TDHCA monitored property, please file a complaint with TDHCA. It's surprising how
do
many.
I know? Is HACA?
It's online now.
It's all online. Just do it anyway. We'll tell you if it's not. I mean, that's the thing, right? You will know within 2 days.
Give me your card and I'll send you the link. It's online now, which is wonderful. It used to be an Excel spreadsheet that you could download on their website. I love it now because now there's an online search engine on their website where you can plug in an address and it'll tell you whether or not it's tax credit property and the year awarded, FYI, if you're trying to shift responsibility to the owner to pay for modifications. So that's just the advocate in me. I will advocate till the cows come home. Give me your card and I'll send it to you.
Good morning. I am an advocate for children with special needs, but I'm also a mother of a daughter that has an auditory processing problem. Myself, I am a walking miracle. I was in a rollover at 84. I was a paraplegic, told I'd never walk again, but I'm here. So I just wanted to say this much. I live in a property on McKinney Falls. And as the lady spoke earlier, of course, transportation is an issue, but thank God I have a car. What I was told by my property management, this is a 55 plus age apartment complex. These apartments where I'm located, nowhere near bus stops. And that's not the issue that I want to speak on. My issue is this: the transportation is an issue, but I was told recently it's an active. There's a difference between a property that's supposed to, like the doors are so heavy, like when you're trying to go inside, if you're carrying anything in your hand and that wind blows, you can fall. So we've been trying to get like a tenants council where we live. There's 3 buildings. So I would say there's over maybe 1,500 apartments there. So my thing is this, I want to be a helpful person to people, not just children anymore, because I'm aging. I'm 58. And me with having my disability, sometimes I can walk, sometimes I need a rollator, sometimes I need a cane. But even sitting in that chair, I have to sit sideways because it hurts. But I wanted to say this, now that I have some names and I wrote down every person that's up there, I would think being in Austin that there wouldn't be such an issue with just having an electric door to just push a button for 55 and up, but because they said active seniors, it's not required. And so when my lease is up, I'm gonna have to make the choice to move because I can't handle that door sometimes. And then when our elevators are out for 2 or 3 weeks, then what are we to do about getting downstairs? I wish to God I would have known about the issue with not having a working refrigerator. For the first 6 months of me living there, I had surgery in January, and my refrigerator went out in April, and they wouldn't repair it till October. I was having to go have people to bring me groceries like every 3 days. I couldn't keep milk, none of that stuff. And I pay rent. I didn't withhold anything, but I was writing letters to my counselors at HACA, writing letters to calling the Austin Tenants Council, doing everything I knew how to do. It's unfortunate that I'm glad I'm at this meeting now. I can use some information to share with these elderly people that are ranging from my age, 55 up to 80 and 90, you know, and it's not fair because it doesn't say active on the application. So therefore, we're kind of in a glitch, but I thank you all for this morning. I missed y'all yesterday. I had a blowout, but I'm here today. Thank you.
Well, one of the things to know, if I could just point real quick, reasonable accommodation provision of the Fair Housing Act can be used in a lot of situations. We would have to look to see when that property was built to know about the design and construction requirements, because there are requirements regarding the weight on that door. There are requirements regarding that. But regardless of that, there can be accommodations to repair or adjust certain things on the property, like the door. And one of the things that she mentioned before, like the ledger, getting a copy of the ledger, you could ask for a meeting, a sit down to explain when they have intellectual issues, to explain the charges and things like that. Regardless of how they practice their services, their policies, if needed due to a disability, you can ask for some type of adjustment, an exception, a change to the way they normally do things if it's needed due to a disability. So whether it's the door or the ledger or the repairs, there are ways that people with disabilities, because they don't experience the way rules are enforced in the same way and they're not affected the same way, there are ways to make accommodations for everything, even regarding whether or not you can leave your shoes outside your front door. I mean, everything.
Yeah, and please contact me. Come get my email address, something if these are problems that you're having or you know that your clients are having. Because all of the things that you mentioned, even down to the refrigerator, are things that we do at Disability Rights Texas to advocate. So I would definitely recommend reaching out to me and mine.
Thank you all for those excellent questions. I want to thank the panel for your expertise, for your the work that you do in this field. And I think that we've shown today that there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of communication, a lot of information to share. And I just want to thank you guys for helping share your information today.
You're welcome.
Thank you.